Hey, welcome to the Horse Hour podcast. I'm Amy Frost, and today we're at the National Equine Forum, where you get to hear from all the top experts in the industry, and we talk about how we're going to make our industry much, much better. You can get involved by using #HorseHour, #NEF. Ask any question that you like and they'll put it to the forum. And today you're going to hear from some of those guest speakers on the podcast. This is Horse Hour. Welcome to the Horse Hour podcast. Every year we cover the National Equine Forum. I find it so fascinating where you have a room of over 100 experts in our industry, and the reason they get together is to talk about the future of the equestrian industry and how we can improve it. And my first guest is Dr. Simon Curtis. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks, Amy.
Now, Simon, we have briefly met before. We met last year at the National Equine Forum because you are an incredible farrier and you won the Sir Colin Spedding Award, which means that this year you're going to be giving the memorial lecture. So let's first hear about what was it like for you winning the award last year?
Well, it was, should we say, the greatest honour of my life, and I mean that. You know, it was, for me, it was almost like the BAFTAs for the equine world, and I still don't know who nominated me, but I'm grateful. And I was told just before I went up that I'd won, which in a way almost spoilt it for me. But so I wasn't told till a day, and just to be nominated was fantastic. And so I got the award and was presented it by the Princess Royal, which was rather nice.
It's pretty amazing, isn't it? And do you know the reasons why you were nominated?
I think it's longevity. I think I've survived longer than most other farriers. No, that's not strictly true. I think, it's rather unusual for a farrier to gain a doctorate. I'm not unique, but as far as I'm concerned, in the world, there's only 3 of us, and they all come from the UK, and I was number 2. I have presented around the world, and I've produced 4 textbooks, one of which has come out since that award, The Hoof of the Horse, and I think I was awarded it for my scientific contribution and to Farriery and equine science in general.
Oh, Simon, well deserved. Your doctorate was awarded for a project studying the development of the foal's hoof, which I'd love to hear more about, the differences between the foal and the adult horse's hoof. I think I could probably do about 20 episodes of the podcast just talking about the horse's hoof because it's mind-blowing, and there's so much to learn from it. So what enticed you to do that study?
Well, as a farrier, although for the first 10 years I didn't have much to do with foals, I've always been in the thoroughbred world. So 90% of my work has been racehorses. And after about 10 years, I started to get some stud farm work. And I realised how fascinating foals were, not just their hooves, but their legs as well, that this is obviously the most dynamic time of development because they're going from about 50 kilos to 400 odd kilos in the space of a couple of years. But everything about them is changing. Their conformation, and from my point of view as a farrier, their hoof shape, their hoof size, the hoof angle is the thing that's quite extraordinary. And none of it had been studied scientifically. For example, the hoof angle has been talked about for over 2,000 years, genuinely, starting off with Xenophon, who was an ancient Greek general. And yet nobody had measured the hoof angles of foals, and we had all this anecdotal evidence and confusing stuff about hoof angles. And so I measured them quite young, an average of 3 months, and then I did them again in the autumn when they were weaned, an average of about 8 months. And one of the things I found, for example, is that they start off on average just about 60 degrees in angle, and all textbooks say that a horse with 60 degrees has a club foot. Well, clearly not. All my foals didn't have club feet. And then they dropped by 1 degree a month. That's a considerable drop in angle. And we sort of knew anecdotally that horses, their angle does decline during aging. So your 15-year-old horse is going to have a slightly lower angle on average than your 10-year-old horse. But it's this descent while they're young, which is just quite extraordinary. And why that's important clinically is, well, almost what I referred to, is that we don't want people confusing a normal, healthy foal with a club-footed horse. Because they might, they then start making decisions on a misdiagnosis, shall we say, and these are just quite healthy at that angle. So I think things like that help the industry in general. They help farriers and vets and horse owners.
It's quite remarkable. I have a new foal. It's my first ever foal, and I was looking at his feet the other day. Bearing in mind, I don't know much. My farriers, I'm very lucky, Simon, because my farrier understands that I will ask 1,000,001 questions, and it's not because I'm criticising him. It's because I'm a sponge and I want to learn. And I was looking at my foal's hoof the other day, and I thought, oh, it is relatively high, and the angle was quite steep, and so it's fascinating to hear you talk about this 60 degree angle, because actually I don't know what angle's right and what isn't. I just know that his hoofs to me looked good. and what can you ascertain good to be is when you've got really don't have much to compare it with.
Well, they're born with pristine hooves because they've been protected within the uterus, so they come out with a high quality of hoof. The other thing that's interesting is that they are pretty symmetrical as individual hooves, and they are paired left and right. So we have nice paired feet, which are symmetrical. If you ask farriers how many 10-year-old horses they shoe with paired symmetrical feet, they will probably, usually if they do 400 or 500 horses, say, oh no, I've got one, it's quite amazing. So the big question in my PhD was, why do they change? And are they changing for healthy reasons, just part of their development, which I think they are to a certain extent. But what is it that causes us to have, shall we say in blunt terms, odd-footed horses, which we have lots of? And so those were the sort of questions that I tried to address. And as always, I addressed some, and I created even more questions along the way. But that's the nature of any research, really.
So does that mean that you're going to be doing more research to find out those answers?
I think I'm slowly but surely reverting back to being a farrier. But I've actually... it's taken one group of researchers so long to get money for a funding that I've semi-retired in the meantime, but I'm sort of helping as an advisor. That's more on mature horses, the effect of shoes on purchase and grip. So in other words, in what way do they affect the flight of the leg and its landing, which is important to people involved with performance horses of any type, whether they're show jumpers or racehorses. So I am engaged there in that. From the foal's point of view, now that I'm semi-retired, but I still will probably have 150 foals on my books this year, which compares with 10 years ago when I was looking after about 750.
Wow.
But that's still a large amount. And there are still there's little gaps in even my study that I would like to fill, because, for example, I said that I had enough foals, I think, to give conclusively what the typical hoof angle is at 3 months. But there's even some funny things that happen between birth and 1 month. For example, I actually think that they go up in angle, first of all, before they start to drop. Yes, because they, from what I can see, they don't get a lot of exercise in the uterus. So when they're born, of course, muscles and tendons and even ligaments are a little bit slack. I know it's extraordinary that they stand up in minutes and they will follow their mum around. All healthy foals do that. But nevertheless, and that's why they strengthen up, because they get exercise straight away. And so up comes the angle initially, and then it starts to drop. So there's a slight gap still in our knowledge there, and I'd like to fill that in. There's a number of other things that I'd like to fill in about young horses and their development, and I'm still working with my previous supervisors from the University of Central Lancashire on getting 4 papers, extracting it from my thesis, and that sort of can be frustrating, getting stuff published at a high scientific level in peer-reviewed journals, but that's what we're doing. So I am still engaged in just trying to get the information out of my thesis, and once it's disseminated through the scientific world, then of course the trick is to try and disseminate it through, shall we say, almost the 3 groups that I've written for, which is farriers, horse owners and veterinary surgeons. So there's still plenty to do.
Yeah, I wonder if there's things that we can do to help you. Is it still scientific if we were all to measure our foal's feet and then send it over to you, or is that not seen as scientific because you can't control it?
Yeah, you can't control it, and that's the problem. It needs somebody. I mean, it's quite easy to get the sizes. I just developed a very simple system of, these calendar stickers, for wall calendars. If you put them on the hoof and take a really good digital photograph, and I used to take 5 every time just to make sure, then of course you've got a calibration on there. And you can use that there's a number of programs that measure. So you then download it and measure. So it is possible to do that. But I, with all due respect to all horse owners, even other farriers.
Look, Simon. We can't even get a weigh tape right. So let's not get us to do anything scientific. And in fact, I can never really understand how people can use other people's data. I mean, maybe I was just too, as a scientist, I couldn't be emotionally attached, but I needed to measure everything myself and check everything myself, which was all part of it because, I wasn't doing a PhD to get a job at the end of it. In fact, I used to laugh at my university. Of course, you get bombarded with emails now saying what my future prospects in my career were because they thought I was 25 or something. And of course, that wasn't why I was doing it. I think I was more akin to these great, well, not that I was great, but these hobby scientists, Victorian hobby scientists, who collected fossils for 10 years and then wrote them up or something. And I was more that, that I was just interested in these foals, and as a farrier, I'd found a way of, of using my opportunity to collect all this data, and that's the thing that I was in an unusual. There wouldn't be many farriers in that position to have all these available, and more importantly, of course, I did have to have the permission of the stud farms, and there was enough that. Allowed me to do that for me to get, extraordinary amount of data on these foals and on their hooves. Not just measuring their dimensions, but even putting them on pressure mats and seeing how they were loading, how foals that had slight flexural deformities were loading differently to a healthy, typical foal. So lots of stuff, really. Amazing.
More than I can probably ever exploit.
Simon, is there anything that we can do to help our young horses? And when I say young horses, I don't necessarily just mean foals. I mean anything up to 5, really, that we can help with their development of their feet. I know that we give them biotin and we have to get them trimmed and look after them in those standard ways. But have you found anything to really work in the youngsters?
Right. First, let me answer that for all horses. When people say, what's the best thing I can do for my horse's hooves? What I say is use wood shaving bedding and get your farrier to trim your horses if they're unshod every 6 weeks, and if they're shod, depending on their job, 6 weeks or less. So that's the easy thing, the best thing, 2 things you can do for your horse's hooves. Now, youngsters do require trimming more often, and one of the main reasons is their hooves are growing at twice the speed of their mum, and any slight deviation in their conformation, and no horse is perfect, so they all have slight deviations, pushes the hoof out of shape. And that was one of the things I could measure. So it is mainly pushing it out of shape, but of course it's almost squeezing it out of shape between the weight of the foal and the ground underneath. And the hoof is dynamic at all times because it's growing faster than any other part of the body. But as I say, with a foal, it's growing at twice the speed of its mum. It's actually growing at half an inch a month. And when you think the hoof of a little foal is probably only 2.5 or 3 inches high, that is proportionately extraordinary. So that's why they go out of shape fairly quickly, and that's the farriers, shall we say, their primary job is to reduce excessive growth, but also to keep trying to put the hoof back into shape. There is always this thing where people say, well, what happens in the wild? They don't need a farrier. Well, in the wild, there's a number of things happen. They're either in an ideal environment, and of course no horses are really in the wild now. Even in Australia, it's not their native land, the million feral horses. But what was found there in Australia is that they vary very much their hooves according to two things: the substrate, so what they walk on, and how far they walk. And it is mainly walking, actually, with the horses. They don't actually do lots and lots of cantering and galloping. But they walk long distances for water and for food. And that really affects their hoof shape. So actually some horses in a natural environment, or shall we say a free-ranging environment, actually could really rather do with the farrier. And some don't need them at all. There's no great cure for the horses' needs. Yeah.
Even in the New Forest or Dartmoor, where they're wild, semi-wild, when the commoners bring the horses in and get their feet trimmed and get their vaccinations and get them checked, but they don't roam. It's really hard to explain. They don't roam the whole of the New Forest. So each of the horses have their own little herds in specific areas, I find. So it means that they're not actually walking that far.
And they're also on relatively soft ground. And they don't have to go that far because they have access to some quite good grazing, don't they? I know it might be patchy. And that's the thing, again, that we sort of forget, that some of these feral horses in places like Australia do not, they have to go long distances to get the right grazing. We have Wicken Fen up close to us here, which I think has now something like 1,000 hectares, so quite a large area. But as you say, the feral horses there, the conics, tend to be in smaller groups. And why would they wander over the whole 1,000 hectares if they've actually got close by access to especially grass and water? So one of the things that was found in Australia with the horses' hooves there is that we all have this ideal view, this sort of utopia of the natural horse. They had just as many problems with their feet and hooves as domestic horses have.
Really?
So we'd all love to think, they're roaming and they're free and they're healthy. Not quite true, actually.
What sort of problems were they finding?
Well, just the same as with domestic ones. They do have laminitis, and they have signs of surviving laminitis and going on. But with all the changes that brings to the hooves, in some situations, they do get very long hooves with all the problems that brings. Some of them almost look like, shall we say, welfare cases. If they were in a domestic situation, we'd expect them to be rescued and their hooves trimmed. And actually, that's one of the things that our horse welfare organisations invariably find. If somebody has shall we say, neglected their horse, they certainly haven't had it trimmed regularly. So one of the first things they do is call in a farrier and get the hooves trimmed while they're trying to, treat their horse for everything from worms to underweight. So yes, so the feral horse, I think we do need to learn lots from feral horses roaming free ranging that we can apply to our domesticated horses. But as I say, in the last 10 years, sadly, it's been proven that this is no utopia, just having a horse wandering freely. They still need our intervention because we've put them there, and we might like to think it's a natural environment, but it's just another environment. And we're not quite sure now, though, the horse came from the Central Asian steppes, but even that would vary. We would think, oh, this is huge, vast grasslands, but there are forests there are water there is rocky ground there, and so it varies a lot. I think the thing is, the horse has a certain parameter which it survives within, but that doesn't mean at either end of that parameter there aren't problems, and it just has to cope with them.
Needs a bit of help, doesn't it? You mentioned earlier that 90 or 95% of the horses that you used to shoe were thoroughbreds. What's the main reason that thoroughbreds they tend to have really weak feet, don't they, and weak walls? Why is that?
Well, the simplest reason is that the average horse has a hoof of about 11.5 millimeters in thickness, and the thoroughbreds is 9.5. So people thinking they're thin-hooved are quite correct. They are. And that may be partially help their athletic supremacy. They don't have quite as heavy a hoof that they have to swing forward and pull back. So just like we run better wearing trainers and boots, the horse is the same. I actually have a thing about the thoroughbred hoof is that it's not as bad as its reputation. It gets hammered in training. So if you buy a thoroughbred that's had 2 years in training, it's probably had 30 sets of shoes on, aluminium and steel. It has been trained quite hard, which, stresses its body, but stresses its hooves. And actually, I don't think a horse gets its fully mature hoof until it's about 5. So if you've, shall we say, as some people do, managed to get a horse out of training, which, a thoroughbred that's only fault is it's not quite as fast as the others. Otherwise, that's usually a very good way of getting a very healthy horse. But it needs to, from my point of view, and it's the only thing I really know about is its hooves, it needs to recover from that stress. But it's still not fully mature. So we often see them on a stud farm point of view, as they come out of training, all sorts of nails in their hooves, breaks in their hooves, have to have shoes on for a while, but we try and get them out of shoes as soon as possible. Trim the hooves regularly once a month, not once every 6 weeks. And then you suddenly look at them when they're 5 years old and they have these lovely, healthy hooves. So I think for people buying horses or taking on these retraining thoroughbreds, then they have to give them a little bit of time. Yes, they have to have a farrier that's sympathetic. Because those hooves are not as thick as other breeds, they need lighter shoes and lighter nails. But having gone through that, most thoroughbreds that are well cared for end up with just as good a hooves as other breeds. As I say, albeit for the rest of their lives they are thinner.
Interesting that you said that lighter shoes. I didn't know you could get lighter shoes.
Yeah, the thickness of shoes and the width of the shoes varies considerably. I mean, quite obviously the Shire is shod with if I revert to imperial measurements, is shod with a shoe that's 1/2 inch thick and 1 inch or 1 1/4 inch wide. So quite a hefty thickness of shoe and a very heavy shoe. Thoroughbreds come down all the way down to sort of 3/4 by 5/16, which is about 19 by 8 mils. And actually you can get 6 and 7 mil shoes. And so the hunter in between is probably only 20 mils in thickness, but it is 8 or 10 mils, 20 mils in width, but 8 or 10 mils in thickness. So, yeah, they vary a lot. And, of course, the nails that go with them vary. And even more technically, how what we call the fineness or the coarseness of the nailing is, in other words, how far in that nail starts, where does it actually enter the hoof. So all those things, and so in other words, a farrier taking on a thoroughbred should not just go to the back of the van and take out the shoes he's been using on hunters or warm bloods, or 10-year-old sports horses, and probably needs to buy some slightly lighter shoes, and that in that way they can do a good shoeing job, and as I say, after a year or so, then they really strengthen up the hooves.
So what are your thoughts on these new variations of shoes that we keep seeing? Glue-on shoes, rubber shoes, plastic shoes, stick-on shoes, Velcro shoes.
Okay. Well, yes, I just have this saying, another day, another horseshoe, because I've been fairly prominent. I get sent them all. I get sent them when there's a new shoe. Somebody sends it to me and says, if we can get Simon to try this. And here's the first thing. Rubber shoes were tried 130 or 140 years ago, because that's how long we've had rubber, as in rubber tyres for our cars. So people have tried different products. Now, before we get into gluing, of course, the real peculiar thing is that aluminium and steel do the job really well for horses, mainly because they're resistant to wear, which is their main reason for being put on a horse's foot, but they have a little bit of slide. If we put something on the bottom of the horse's foot that totally stops it sliding, and if you look at a barefooted horse, as it puts its foot down, the foot moves forward a couple of inches, then somewhere that slide's got to be taken up. So it's in the joints or somewhere. So we have to think about what goes on the bottom. So rubber shoes on roads, and there still is at least one brand of rubber shoes. The problem is, yes, the rider says straight away they've got lots of grip, but actually they've got too much grip. And that's been found to cause problems. Really? Then there's the other side of the coin, that nylon shoes and polymer shoes that have been used actually don't quite have enough grip, and especially on grass. And owners will suddenly say, my horse feels like it's on ice skates, and the horse loses confidence and the owner does. So we have to be careful of that. And a lot of the new shoes are polymers, which for most of us would not be incorrect if we called it plastic. So polyurethane shoes. Now, gluing on, I'd like to think I was one of the pioneers of gluing on. My first book 20 years ago had the first example of successful gluing on in it.
Wow. And
that method is still used. Acrylic glues really glue extremely well to hoof, and they glue extremely well to aluminium. They're not as good with steel. So that's why in racing we have tended to use aluminium, and lots of racehorses have successfully run and won in glue-on shoes. They have very few drawbacks. The only thing is the main part of the gluing is to the back half of the foot. That's the part of the foot that moves the most in locomotion. So you are restricting their movement. I think we've got away with it because, again, we use quite thin aluminium shoes, and much as they seem pretty tough, you can just about move them in your hand. So a half-ton horse moves them quite a bit. So they do actually slightly flex with the foot. So that type of gluing is successful. In the last couple of years, you're quite right, people have tried a variety of what I'd call cuff-type shoes. So in other words, they're gluing around the outer wall, and there's a shoe on the bottom, and it looks more similar to our type of shoe, or Crocs or something, that it just goes around the outside and it glues there. One of the problems is because it's farriers that buy them and put them on, sometimes these shoes are what I would call farrier friendly and not necessarily hoof friendly. So they're relatively easy for the farrier to put on, but they're not necessarily the best shoe to allow the horse's hoof to move or even breathe. But there are plenty. Nobody yet has replaced traditional nailing. They're still too expensive to replace it. But I'm sure one day somebody will actually come up with an idea and they will make a lot of money.
Yeah.
In other words, if we invented, well, if we suddenly discovered the horse in the last few years and found it was great fun riding it and whatever else we do with it, and then we found we needed shoes on the bottom, and I said, I've got a brilliant idea. I'm going to nail some iron to your horse's foot. You would say, no, you are not. No. So if we'd come about the problem today rather than 2,000 years ago, I think we would have been gluing on every shoe. Glues, I think people are unaware how much glues are used now. Your railway carriage is made of aluminium and is held together by acrylic glue because it's better and easier and stronger than welding. And so some of these glues are extraordinary. They're tweaked a little bit for the horse world. Not a lot. They pretend they've developed them just for the horse, but what they are is as an adjunct to the aerospace industry, or as I say, the train industry, or lots of other industries. So lots of new materials, and we're just finding out how to use them best.
Well, really. the question, this is going to sound it could sound quite crazy, but I quite often compare the horse's hoof to my own nails. And, for years we've been using acrylic nail glue on our own nails and they work fine. However, if you break a nail, it really hurts, Simon. And I feel in two minds because with a nail on a horse's hoof, I'm sure it would hurt if they rip the shoe off and the nail comes out, but it's in a place where it's not really going to hurt them.
I was going to say you're quite right to say, the human nail and the horse's hooves is anatomically the same thing. It's just we're two ends of the extreme. You can live quite well without your nail. You might not want to. The horse can't live without its hoof because it's got a single toe and it walks on the tip of it. But yes, I'm sure sometimes when a horse loses a shoe, if it doesn't break any hoof away, then I don't think it feels 1% of pain. If it rips some hoof off, I'm pretty sure in the instant it rips it off, it must feel it. And then it's very rare for us ever to have shoe loss or hoof loss where you actually rip down to the sensitive tissue.
Oh, really? And, even with glues? Because that's why I thought that, I didn't realise so many people did glue their horses' shoes on. And the reason I haven't asked to move over to that is because if it's stuck to different parts of the horse's hoof, then potentially, if the horse was to stand on it or was to rip it off, it could cause maybe more damage.
I have to tell you, Amy, that any farrier that's competent at gluing shoes on, as I said how strong the bond is, they can't pull them off. I'm serious about that. I remember when I first started gluing shoes on and I glued on a little pony and I sort of forgot about it, and that was in June. In November, I got a phone call, could I come back and glue on? I said, oh dear, has the same problem occurred? And they said, no, one of the shoes has come loose. So that's 5 months later, and that would be typical of well-glued shoes. So it actually makes it even more imperative that the shoeing cycle is decided before the shoe's glued on, because those hooves still grow underneath, they get longer. The glue the adherence does diminish slightly because, of course, the hoof has its natural oils, and the one thing all glues don't like is oil or grease. So it does sort of get behind the glue. So actually, taking the shoe off 6 or 8 weeks later is relatively easy, but it mainly involves cutting the glue off. You can't just pull them off even then. But if you actually have to take a shoe off, a glued-on shoe, 1 day later, now that's pretty difficult, and the horse does feel it because it's so well attached. And fortunately, I've only had that in a couple of occasions in 20 years.
Wow. So we're going to need to be wrapping our horses' hoofs in acetone and foil then, leaving them for 40 minutes to re-glue.
No. Oh, you do know, yeah, you know the acetone. I'll tell you the funny thing: the acrylic glue attaches so well that actually I don't use acetone anymore, and that's exactly what we used. Because if I rasp the hoof, and I mean just a fine layer, you're down to very clean hoof, and these glues attach so well that's what I do. But when we first did them, that's just what we did, and believe it or not, people often used baby nappies, the disposable ones, because they're quite easy. They're about the right size for a horse's hoof, and so you'd acetone the foot and wrap that round while you got on with the other foot and then came back to it. So it is the same situation. And the one thing about gluing on and using the same for repair is that, horse owners always say, that smells just like my nail varnish remover, or that smells just like the glue. And I say, well, that's because it is. That's exactly what it is, and it's doing the same job. Your fingernail is horn. I know we don't call it that, but it is horn. And, and that's why the two glues do the same job.
Which makes me wonder. So let me tell you a little secret. In my previous life, when I was about 17, I learnt how to become a nail technician. So I used to put on acrylic nails, and I was a human nail technician. So when we have these developments now with gel and shellac and all these other things, I know this sounds crazy, but if we're using acetone and we're using acrylic on our horses using the glue, why haven't we moved some of those other things across to the equine world to almost put barriers around? Because with probably not so much shellac. I think shellac would be too there'd be too much slide. We were talking about slide, but is there a way? I mean, maybe we're coming up with a new product idea here, Simon. This is it. We're going to be millionaires next year.
Well, we're going to make $1 million. Yeah.
But my thought, the issues that I have with the horse's hoof is the horse is, my horse particularly, is huge. He's a Friesian Cross Gelderlander. He has very strong feet, but he needs to have shoes. They're not strong enough for him to be bareback. They crumble. He needs shoes. However, he slides. Oh my goodness, the amount that he slides is just insane. And I've tried everything. We've had road nails. On the roads, he slides really bad. So he needs a little bit more grip. So is there not a way that we can combine maybe some of the old techniques that we used to use by having the steel and the nails combined with a little bit of rubber on there, or a bit of this gel that we use on our own nails now to protect our own nails, which is also easier to remove? Rather than it covering the whole of the shoe, could we use a combination?
Well, I'm afraid you're losing me with shellac and that, because actually, I clearly I don't go to nail clinics, but okay. So, yes, if your horse is still sliding, then it clearly or sliding too much, it needs more grip. And if you've tried road nails on the road and it's still sliding, then that's a little bit unusual, but I'm sure that's what's happening. Road studs are another step up. So they, again, have a tungsten pin in them. And tungsten's the hardest metal known. And it just, you can wear the whole shoe out and the tungsten's still sticking up there, totally unworn. So that's the idea of a tungsten pin in either a stud or a road nail, is that it digs into the surface a little bit. The other thing that's used is that there are tungsten chips that can be welded in. So the Farrier, using his gas fire, puts one of these tungsten chips, at the toe, and usually 2 dots at the heel. They melt down in a flux, and when you take them out of the fire, there they are, stuck forevermore to the shoe. And they sort of resist wear, but they also give even more grip. So that's another way of applying grip, especially for horses on roads. I wrote an article 20 years ago, which was actually a bit of fun, and it was almost a science fiction look at what we'd be doing. And I came up with a product that we would squeeze out of a gun, and we do have, some of our glues, you do that. But you would also, as an owner, say how much grip you wanted. So in other words, there would be, shall we say, to put it bluntly, chunks of grip within the glue. And the glue would set on the shoe, or you'd go around the edge. Now, we're sort of halfway there in a way, in that the polymer urethane glues, they come out of a gun and one of them sets in 45 seconds. Here's the problem. After about 10 days or maybe 2 weeks, they go brittle and they start breaking off your horse's hoof. So as a sort of instant cure, which I've done for a horse that didn't want shoes on but needed to be lifted just off the ground for a little bit more comfort, that works. So I'm not a chemist, but any chemist out there that can make a glue, a polymer glue that sticks better and then can include something that makes them grip more, that's the way forward. And there's lots and lots of inventive people out there, and who knows, at this very moment, Amy, somebody might have overcome those problems. But that's the thing. We always have to remember that whatever we have on the bottom of our horse's foot, whether it's a traditional shoe, barefoot, or some new glue-on shoe, is that the primary reason for shoeing a horse is for protection, and the secondary is for grip and purchase. All the others are just to do with remedial reasons or correcting leg. So whenever I look at a new shoe, and as I say, they don't quite arrive daily, but that's my joke, is that they certainly arrive monthly, and they say, oh, it's made of nylon. And I say, just because you make a shoe from another material, you have to say, well, what is your purpose? What's the aim? What does it overcome that we don't overcome already? But one day somebody will get there, and I certainly don't knock this current generation of, as I say, cuff-type shoes. They're still too expensive for everyday use, usually costing the owner somewhere around £150 a pair to put on.
Wow. So
you need a serious reason why your horse can't do with traditional shoeing. So that's the restriction. They cost the farrier so much, they take more time, you have to learn to put them on. I think once they come down to within the sort of range of cost of shoeing that we've got, I think in this country, which is, £70 to £100 a set of shoes to be put on, then they're going to start being used more. But we're still a long way from that. But it'll come one day. I hope to see it in my life.
Yeah, me too. Well, like I said, we'll come up with the idea. We'll be living on a boat in Monaco saying that was the solution. No, I'm joking. Well, Dr. Simon Curtis, it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you. 44 years. Is it 44 years in the industry you've had now?
Oh, I think it's more like 46 now. 46, Amy.
46 years.
I need to keep updating my biography. Yes.
And only 1 in 3 people in the world who has a doctorate, and they're all from the UK. It's just amazing. I could literally talk to you for hours. And thank you for all the advice that you've given us today and for your research. I'd actually like to read a couple of your books. Now, I'm not a farrier, but I'm like a little sponge. I want to learn as much as possible. Where can I get hold of your books?
Well, you can get hold of all my books if you go to Curtis Farrier Books.
Oh, really?
So if you put that in, I don't run that side of it. My publishers do. But if you Google Curtis Farrier Books, and I have a website there, and you can either buy them direct. It also has a list of all the book stockists around the world. So the nearest one to you also, you can get them. So they are quite widely available. That's the way to do it. Amazing. Curtis Farrier Books.
So the one that I'm looking at now, it's if you Google Curtis Farrier Books, it shows up, is The Hoof of the Horse. That's your latest one, isn't it? Released at the end of last year.
That came out 2 months ago. Yes. So that's right in my mind, and that's it is what it says on the tin, as it were. It's trying to bring together all the knowledge that we have about the horse's hoof. So totally different from my other books.
Yeah.
That's where it is. And
this is really exciting. You have joined the world of podcasts because you've now started doing your own podcast.
I have, Amy. I would love to think one day I'm as slick and professional as you are, but I'm trying to get farriers from around the world. We stay fairly light-hearted, informative, but not too heavy duty. And I've already done some good ones: a Farrier in South Africa, a Farrier in Malta, one in America which hasn't come out yet, one in Scotland. So I'm trying to, every time I travel, I try and grab a Farrier who has, a story to tell, and they all do, just as I'm sure you find with your podcast. It's just extracting the information and getting them to talk, and so I'm enjoying that part of my career as well.
Oh, brilliant. Well, you can listen to that on iTunes, SoundCloud, YouTube. You're on Acast. I'm super proud of you for being on Acast, because we were one of the first on that site. And Acast are a brilliant platform to listen to podcasts. So yeah, Stitcher, Player FM, Podbean, you're on them all. So I'm going to be downloading the Simon Curtis podcast. It's called Hoof of the Horse, an equine science and farriery show. Simon, thank you so much. Thanks for being at the National Equine Forum, for being an advocate for the industry. Huge congratulations on your Sir Colin Spedding Award last year, and we look forward to, well, hopefully, I'd really like to speak to you again someday. Maybe when the horses are a little bit older, and we're at the stage of talking. I don't know. We can see what the advances are. Maybe we should catch up in a year's time and say, "Hey, you were right."
As we sit on the deck of our boat in Monaco,
I
guess. Amy, it's been brilliant talking to you as well. So thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks so much. See you.
Bye, Amy.
Thanks so much for listening. Don't forget you can catch previous episodes of the Horse Hour podcast on our website. Just head to horsehour.co.uk, and of course you can hear all the guest speakers from the National Equine Forum on their website, nationalequineforum.com. Have a great week with your horse, and I'll speak to you soon.